They say Lagos doesn't sleep, but they don't talk about the people it keeps wide awake either. My name is Amaka Nwosu. And before I became a woman who walks into boardrooms with her head high and her heart guarded, I was just another daughter on a plastic chair in a public hospital corridor, praying my mother would make it through the night. That was the night everything changed. Not because of a miracle, but because a stranger with quiet eyes and a sharp suit paid a bill I couldn't afford, then disappeared like a rumor nobody believed. I never got to say thank you. I never even knew his name until 3 years later when I walked into his glass-walled office in Victoria Island. He looked at me like I was a ghost. I looked at him like he was a debt I never asked to owe. He had once saved me. Now I had been sent to save his company. And in Lagos, that kind of power shift always comes with blood on the floor. Welcome to Luxurious Echoes. Make sure you like and subscribe. Let's get into the story. The first night in the hospital didn't break me. It was the second, third, the fifth. By the time we reached the seventh, I had memorized the shape of the peeling ceiling above the plastic chair where I slept, the rhythm of the security guards coughing at 3 a.m., and the shame that came with pretending I wasn't crying. My mother lay in the emergency ward behind cracked glass panels, unconscious, fragile, hooked to an IV that might stop any moment if the deposit wasn't paid. Nurses whispered around me like I was invisible. That woman in bed 4. If they don't pay, we can't continue treatment. I hated the sound of my name being mentioned like a burden, a case file, a mistake. I had tried everything, sold my phone for pennies in Ikeja, borrowed from my cousin in Mushin, texted classmates I hadn't spoken to in years. I even sent a message to my ex-boyfriend, knowing it would invite insults, and he delivered, typing "you day mad," before blocking me. The bill stood like a mountain I couldn't climb. 50,000 naira to continue treatment. 180,000 total. The numbers danced in front of me. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I just watched my mother's chest rise and fall and tried not to wonder when it would stop. Lagos teaches you that suffering is public, but help is private, hidden behind doors you can't open. I went to the billing office again that morning, heart pounding, mouth dry. I had nothing new to offer them, no deposit, no promise, just desperation in my voice. "She's getting worse," I told the woman behind the glass. Her nails were too bright for the sadness in her eyes. "Madam, I understand," she said in Yoruba. "But no doctor will touch her again without that deposit." The words felt like a slap, even though she said them gently. I turned away before I started crying again. Outside, I sat on the bench where the sun hit hardest, hoping heat would distract me from hopelessness. People walked past, some in scrubs, some in suits, none of them seeing me. My stomach twisted from hunger and fear. I thought maybe I'd collapse and die right there. Then I heard footsteps stop in front of me. Shiny brown shoes. Trousers that didn't belong on this side of the hospital. I looked up and saw a man, tall, calm, dark-skinned, sharply dressed. His eyes scanned me, but not like I was pitiful. More like he was reading a question only I could answer. "Are you the one with the woman in bed 4? He asked. My voice failed, so I nodded. I heard them say, "You're stuck." I wanted to fight him, to tell him I didn't need pity. But all I could whisper was, "Yes." He didn't introduce himself with flair. He didn't kneel beside me like those performative charity men you see on Instagram, posing with hungry people for likes. He just stood there, then looked past me toward the hospital entrance. "Where's the billing office?" he asked. His voice was low, even. Like he had done this before. I was too confused to speak, but I pointed. He nodded, walked off, and disappeared into the building. I didn't move. I told myself not to get my hopes up. He might be a social worker or someone collecting information for a church. But a tiny part of me dared to believe, and that part began to shake. 10 minutes later, the same woman from billing came outside and called my name. I stood slowly, expecting more bad news. "He paid it," she said. "All of it." I stared at her. "Who?" She tilted her head toward the corridor where I had just come from. I ran. I didn't even know what I was chasing. But he was already leaving. I saw his back, his pace deliberate, like a man used to walking away before people thanked him. I called out, "Wait," and he turned just slightly. I didn't even know what to say. "Why?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. "Because I couldn't walk away," he said. I tried to run after him, but he moved like someone who didn't want to be followed. Within seconds, he had crossed the car park and slid into a black Range Rover with tinted windows. The kind that says, "Don't ask questions." I stood there like a child left behind. When I returned to the billing counter, they handed me a printed receipt with the words, "Paid in full," stamped in red. Beneath the stamped text was a name, Damilola Adeyemi. It sounded familiar, like something I might have seen in a business magazine or overheard in a conversation too rich for me. I googled it on a borrowed phone later that night, just his name. And there he was, CEO of Adeyemi Maritime and Logistics, one of those companies that make money from oil, ships, and quiet power. My hands trembled. What kind of billionaire walks into a public hospital and pays a stranger's bill without asking for a picture, a favor, or even thanks? My mother opened her eyes that same evening, weak but alive. I held her hand and didn't tell her how close I had come to losing her. I didn't tell her about Damilola either. Something about it didn't feel real. It felt private, like a secret seed buried deep in the soil of my shame. The thing about help in Lagos is that it always comes with an invisible receipt, a debt that grows slowly, waiting for a day when someone will cash in. I spent weeks expecting a call, a message, a request. None came. My mother recovered faster than expected. She went from silent murmurs to short walks around the hospital. We were discharged 2 weeks after he paid, and I signed out with the kind of gratitude that felt too big to say out loud. But the silence started to worry me. Who was he really? What did he want? Nobody helps a complete stranger without reason. That's not how this city works. I went back to the hospital and asked the front desk about him. The cashier only shook her head and said, "Some people get spirit of giving. Maybe not angel." But I didn't want an angel, I wanted closure. I tried to find his office online, his email, even a staff contact. Everything led to dead ends or layers of assistance I couldn't get through. One girl at reception told me bluntly, "Oga doesn't respond to random calls or messages." Even board members book appointments through his PA. Just like that, he became a myth. A miracle man with no follow-up. And it drove me mad. My mother said I was obsessing. "Just thank God and move on," she told me, shaking her head as she stirred ogbono soup in our one-room kitchen. But she didn't understand what it felt like to owe a ghost. I kept imagining him watching from afar, judging what I'd do with my second chance. Would I waste it? Would I become someone worth the cost he paid? I got angry. Not at him but at myself. At the fact that I had to be saved in the first place. At the way poverty makes you grateful for being noticed. I hated feeling helpless. And that anger became fuel. I started applying for anything that looked like growth. Online courses, remote jobs, NGO internships. I cleaned a friend's house for small money. I enrolled in a public speaking program with my last savings, not because I wanted to give speeches, but because I was tired of being small in rooms where power spoke in clean English. That stranger had walked away, but the receipt he left behind stayed in my pocket, folded, silent, and burning. And I told myself one thing: I will never need saving again. Life didn't suddenly become soft. I still fought for space on BRT buses, still took cold showers with water from plastic drums, still stretched rice and stew across 3 meals. But something inside me had changed. I walked differently. I argued better. I didn't accept insults from people who thought they were doing me a favor. I cut off my ex completely. I deleted numbers that didn't add value. I spent my nights studying YouTube videos on business etiquette and Excel functions. I started a small podcast where I talked about surviving Lagos as a woman with no backup plan. It didn't go viral, but one day, a woman who listened sent me a DM offering mentorship. She worked with a business consultancy firm that trained young professionals for corporate placements. I jumped at the opportunity. The first day I walked into that small 6 office wearing a second-hand blazer and shoes one size too tight, I felt something click. Like maybe, just maybe, I belonged in this world too, this world of keycards, elevators, strategy decks, and leather chairs. In that same building, I met people who shaped the next chapter of my life. Colleagues who gave honest feedback. A manager who forced me to toughen up. A mentor who told me, "You're not here to impress. You're here to deliver." I failed sometimes. I cried after presentations that didn't land. But I didn't quit. That was my vow now. No more quitting. No more waiting for help. I moved from intern to project assistant. From assistant to analyst. I got my first proper laptop and then my first business card. And still, every night before bed, I looked at the receipt from the hospital, now folded and soft from wear, and whispered the same thing. "You didn't save me. You just lit the fire. The rest is mine to earn." I stopped looking for him. Not because I forgot. but because I didn't want my story to end with a man changed my life. Well, I changed my life. And I had a long way to go. They don't tell you how lonely growth feels, how the people you start with won't always understand your hunger, how you'll outgrow some friendships the way you outgrow shoes that start to pinch. I cut my hair. Not for fashion, but because I didn't have time for salon appointments anymore. I stopped picking every call, stopped explaining why I couldn't show up at birthday hangouts or bridal showers. Every minute was precious, split between online classes, low-paying internships, and consulting gigs that paid me in exposure. I read every article I could find on corporate strategy, watched free webinars until my eyes hurt, slept in buses from Yaba to Victoria Island and arrived with my skirt creased and my confidence hanging by a thread. But I stayed. I watched. I learned. I asked questions. And little by little the invisible doors started to creak open. A mentor, Mrs. Oseji, pulled me aside one day after a team presentation and said, "You ask the kind of questions that make people uncomfortable. That's a good thing." That moment I realized I was no longer just the girl from the corridor. I was becoming something else, something dangerous to those who preferred silence. My big break didn't come with fireworks. It came in a dusty boardroom at a mid-tier strategy firm where I had been placed as an analyst. We were working on a turnaround plan for a logistics company whose operations had been bleeding for years. Everyone on the team focused on marketing and downsizing, but I noticed something odd in the vendor payments, patterns that didn't add up. I flagged it quietly during a night email. The next morning the managing partner called me in. I thought I was in trouble. But instead he asked me to explain my findings again, this time in front of the client. What followed was a 6-hour war room session, where my data changed the entire direction of the contract. That company was Adeyemi Maritime and Logistics. At the time I didn't connect the dots. I only knew that my analysis had landed on the desk of some big investors, and a few weeks later, I received a cryptic message from an external recruiter. "We're looking for someone to step into a critical interim role. You were recommended for your ability to cut through noise. Let's talk." That's how it began. I thought it would be another project gig. I had no idea I was about to walk into the orbit of the very man I had spent years trying to forget. The email came with no warning. Just a PDF attached to a brief message from the board. "Please find enclosed your formal appointment letter. Effective 2 weeks from today, you are to resume as Executive Director Special Operations at Adeyemi Maritime and Logistics." The title itself knocked the air out of my lungs. I had applied for advisory support roles before, but this wasn't advisory. This was directorship. This was war. I stared at the company letterhead for a long time, unable to move. It was only after the third read that I noticed the CEO's name in the signature line. Damilola Adeyemi. My chest tightened like a fist had closed around it. I zoomed in, hoping it was coincidence. But the name was too specific. Too familiar. I opened my old hospital receipt again, the one I kept folded inside my Bible, and matched the letters one by one. Same name. Same man. 3 years later, fate had done what my curiosity never could. It had led me straight into his company, but not as a desperate girl at the billing counter. This time I was entering with credentials. With backing. With purpose. For a moment I considered backing out. What if he remembered me? What if this was some twisted test or setup? But I shook those thoughts away. I wasn't that girl anymore. I had been sent by the investors themselves, after the company's latest audit scandal exposed years of internal fraud. My job was to identify and eliminate corruption, to restore investor confidence, and to ensure transparency from the ground up. I would be working independently, reporting directly to the board. That meant Damilola couldn't fire me. He couldn't control me. And that made me dangerous in a company like his. I knew enough about Lagos business to understand the politics would be cutthroat. There would be saboteurs. Power games. Whispered insults. But I was ready. My mother always said, "You don't slap water and expect it not to splash." This was my splash. I had spent 3 years preparing for it. I didn't need to seek closure anymore. I was the storm now. And Damilola, whether he liked it or not, was going to see what happened when a girl you once saved comes back with a mission and a seat at the table. The Adeyemi Maritime headquarters stood like a promise in the heart of Victoria Island. Glass, steel, and silence. Not the loud, brash kind of money. No. This building whispered power. From the polished marble floors in the reception to the clean air that smelled of imported leather and chilled ambition, Everything told me I didn't belong here. Not really. But I walked in anyway, chin up, heels steady, folder clutched tight in my palm like a sword. The security guard at the gate barely glanced at me until I flashed the appointment letter. Then his posture changed. That's how Lagos works. They don't respect your face. They respect your backing. I was escorted to the top floor by a receptionist who kept glancing at my shoes, probably wondering if someone had made a mistake. But by the time we reached the executive wing, I had already put my armor on. I had worked too hard to flinch now. When the door to the CEO's office opened and I stepped inside, the first thing I saw wasn't the desk or the view. It was him sitting reading, unaware. Demolola Adeyemi. He looked up as I entered, and for a split second, something passed across his face, like recognition slammed into him but had nowhere to go. He stood slowly, his hand halfway extended, then stopped. You? He said, but nothing followed. I didn't give him time. Good morning, Mr. Adeyemi. I'm Amaka Nwankwo. The board sent me to lead your special operations unit. My voice was level. Polished. Not a single crack. I didn't blink. And that's when I saw it, the shift in his eyes. Not surprise. Not even guilt. Just recalculation. Like a man updating a mental file he thought was closed. Welcome, he said finally. His voice hadn't changed. Calm, deep, smooth like velvet over stone. I wasn't informed it would be you. I smiled, small, polite, dangerous. I wasn't informed it would be you either. He gestured to a seat, but I didn't sit. Let's get something clear, I continued. I'm not here to revisit the past. I'm here to fix what's broken in your company. I'm not your staff. I report to the board. That moment something new settled between us. Not familiarity. Not friendship. Just a loaded silence, thick with what neither of us said. Our first week was war, polished, polite corporate war. Dami would nod in meetings, listen to my reports, and then reroute instructions through other executives behind my back. I'd catch it in team memos, in reworded budget notes, in subtle reshuffling of staff that undermined my authority. I didn't react publicly. That was what he wanted. Instead, I documented every pushback, every delay, every contradiction. Lagos business culture is built on ego, and I refused to feed his. When I requested access to old procurement files, his head of operations claimed they were in review. When I asked about vendor records, someone conveniently went on leave. It wasn't just sabotage, it was a test. He was waiting to see if I would bend, if I would defer. But I had learned how men like him played chess. And this time I wasn't a pawn. I was a queen walking straight down the board. Outside the boardroom, the whispers began. She must know someone on the board. Who is she, Ev? I heard she's dating the chairman. Every strong woman in a high seat becomes a rumor magnet. And the more silent I stayed, the louder the murmurs grew. Dami didn't say much, but he watched me closely. I could feel it, his eyes lingering during strategy reviews, his tone sharpening whenever I took charge of a discussion. I knew he was used to being the smartest person in the room. Now someone else had come with facts, clarity, and authority he couldn't dismiss. One evening, after a particularly tense review session, he called out as I walked past his office. You came prepared, he said. I stopped, turned. I had 3 years to prepare, I replied, then kept walking. I didn't look back to see his reaction. But I knew. The war had started. And I wasn't fighting for revenge. I was fighting to prove that I didn't need saving anymore, and that sometimes gratitude ends when power begins. The first sign that I had entered a war zone wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was the way my office keycard refused to work on Monday morning, forcing me to stand in front of glass doors like a visitor while a junior staff member behind the reception desk pretended not to notice. It was the way the staff I requested for my special operations unit suddenly became unavailable, because their department heads claimed they were critical to core operations. It was the way emails went unanswered until late, reports arrived half-complete, and meetings were scheduled without my knowledge. Yet every time I raised the issue, someone would smile politely and say, "Apologies, Ma. It must have been an oversight." Oversight. That word became the company's favorite weapon. When you're a woman in a senior position in Lagos, people rarely fight you openly. They fight you by making your power look imaginary. By treating you like you're only important on paper. I had walked into Adeyemi Maritime with a mandate from investors, yes, But I was learning quickly that mandates don't scare people who have survived years of corruption. Those ones don't fear a new boss. They fear exposure. And if you represent exposure, they will try to suffocate you before you can even breathe. By the end of that week, I was certain somebody was deliberately setting me up to fail. One afternoon, I requested procurement records from the last 18 months, vendor payments, contract approvals, invoices, everything. They sent me 3 folders of printed documents with missing pages, faded receipts, and signatures that looked like they had been photocopied 10 times. When I asked for the digital backups, the IT manager told me there was a temporary system crash, and they were working on recovery. I knew it was a lie because the company's main server room had a backup generator bigger than my entire street at home. They could not afford to crash by accident. That evening I stayed late, alone, going through the documents with a pen and a calculator like my life depended on it. Somewhere around 9:45 p.m., my office door opened without a knock. I looked up sharply and saw Dammy standing there, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, eyes unreadable. "You're still here," he said like he hadn't been tracking my schedule all week. I didn't respond warmly. "Somebody is blocking me," I said instead. "I know." He stepped closer, dropped a slim file on my desk, and I froze when I saw the label. "Vendor Audit Internal." "You didn't get this from them," he said quietly. "You got what they wanted you to get." I stared at him, suspicious. "And why are you helping me?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "Because if they succeed in breaking you, the next thing they will do is bury this company," he replied. His voice was calm, but his eyes weren't. "And I won't let them." For the first time since I walked into his office, I felt it. This wasn't him trying to control me. This was him trying to survive. The question had been sitting inside my chest like a stone since the day I saw his name on that receipt. I had avoided asking because I didn't want to sound small again. I didn't want to be the poor girl from the corridor begging for explanations. But the office tension, the sabotage, and the way he dropped that file like he had been waiting for the right moment. It pushed something loose inside me. On Friday, after a brutal meeting where a senior executive openly dismissed my audit request as disruptive, I walked into Dammy's office without an appointment. His secretary tried to stop me, but my voice didn't shake when I said, "Tell him I'm already inside." The look on her face was priceless. Dammy looked up from his laptop slowly, his eyes narrowing like he was preparing for a fight. "This is not the best time," he said. I shut the door behind me. "You don't get to decide when the best time is," I replied. His lips pressed into a line. "What do you want?" The word sounded like a challenge. I stepped forward until I was standing in front of his desk. "I want to understand you," I said. Then I paused because even I didn't know why those words came out the way they did. I shook my head quickly. "No. Let me say it properly. I want to understand that day. Why you paid my mother's hospital bill." The air changed instantly. His face didn't lose control, but something in his eyes did, like a door cracked open and slammed shut again. He didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and stared at the city behind me through his glass wall like he could find his excuse on the third mainland bridge. "I did what anyone would do," he said finally. It sounded rehearsed. Polished. I almost laughed. "That's a lie," I said flatly. "Anyone would do that? In Lagos? A man who drives a Range Rover and wears a watch worth my mother's entire rent?" His eyes flicked back to mine, sharper now. "Be careful how you speak to me." I didn't flinch. "I'm not your staff," I reminded him, voice cold. "And I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for truth." Silence stretched. He stood up slowly, walked around his desk, and stopped close enough that I could smell his cologne, expensive, clean, masculine. But I refused to let it distract me. "You want truth?" he asked. His voice dropped. "Fine. Truth is, I didn't pay because I'm a good man." My throat tightened. He continued. "I paid because I saw you and I remembered something I don't like remembering." His jaw clenched like he regretted every word. "Someone I loved needed help once. At a hospital like that. I was too late." I swallowed. "Your sister?" I asked quietly. His eyes flinched. Not confirmation but pain. "It doesn't matter who," he replied. "What matters is that I couldn't save them. And when I saw you about to lose your mother the same way." His voice trailed off. Then he turned away like he had exposed too much. I stood still, my heart beating too loud. For the first time, my anger softened, not into love, not into softness, but into understanding. Because grief didn't care whether you were rich or poor. It only cared whether it could break you. And Dammy had been broken long before I walked into his office. The board meeting felt like walking into a cage full of lions dressed in expensive suits. The boardroom was on the highest floor, quiet, cold, glass everywhere, with a long glossy table that reflected my face back at me like a mirror daring me to doubt myself. The investors had flown in from Abuja and London. A few senior members sat with the confidence of people who had never begged anyone for anything in their lives. The board chair, Chief Bamidele Okonkwo, gave me a brief smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We've heard impressive things," he said. "Your turnaround work. Your sharp eyes." I nodded respectfully, but my back stayed straight. Compliments in Lagos corporate circles are never free. They are usually the sugar before the medicine. The moment the meeting started, I understood what my appointment truly meant. I wasn't here to assist Dammy. I was here to watch him. To test him. To make sure the scandal didn't stain investor money. They wanted results, not emotions. They wanted a knife, not a friend. And somehow I was expected to be both professional and fearless in a room full of men who could ruin my career with a single phone call. When I presented my preliminary findings, vendor inflation, duplicate payments, missing authorizations, the room didn't react with shock. They reacted with calculation. Some faces stayed neutral. Others looked irritated, like I was stating what they already knew but preferred to keep quiet. Then one man, Mr. Collins Ajibade, leaned forward and said, "You're confident in these accusations?" Accusations. As if fraud was a rumor and not mathematics. "I'm confident in the numbers," I replied calmly. "And I'm confident somebody inside this organization has been laundering money through fake vendors." A few eyes shifted to Dammy. He sat still, expression unreadable. Another board member, older woman, icy tone, asked, "Are you suggesting the CEO is unaware?" My heartbeat didn't change. "I'm suggesting either he is unaware, which is dangerous," I said slowly, "or he is aware and tolerating it, which is worse." The silence that followed tasted like blood. Then Chief Bamidele nodded once. "Good," he said. "That is exactly why we brought you." My stomach sank. Not because of fear, but because I suddenly understood. They didn't bring me here to fix the company. They brought me here to decide who should fall. And whether I liked it or not, Dammy was sitting right beside the trapdoor. I started noticing Dammy in ways I didn't want to. Not as a man. Not romantically. Just as a person carrying something heavy behind his expensive calm. The CEO mask he wore in meetings was flawless, controlled voice, sharp decisions, no emotion. But outside the spotlight, I caught glimpses of exhaustion in him that money couldn't erase. I saw how he stayed late even when he had no reason to prove anything. How he stared at the city skyline like it was blaming him. How his security detail watched him like they were guarding a man with enemies, not just wealth. One evening as I walked past the executive lounge, I heard raised voices behind the door, his voice low but firm and another voice pleading. I didn't mean to listen, but Lagos teaches you that silence is how you survive. "You can't keep ignoring this," the voice said. "It will blow up." Dammy answered, "It already has." I walked away before I could hear more, but the words clung to my skin. It already has. Whatever guilt he carried wasn't small. It wasn't theoretical. It had history. Blood. Loss. And it made me wonder if the hospital bill wasn't kindness at all, but a desperate attempt at redemption. That night I stayed late again and found him in the hallway, alone, leaning against the window with his phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call quickly when he saw me, but not fast enough to hide the tension in his shoulders. "Your board meeting didn't go well," he said, voice neutral. "It went exactly how they wanted it to," I replied. He gave a humorless smile. "They want a sacrifice." I folded my arms. "Do you think it should be you?" The question came out sharper than I intended. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me for a long moment, like he was weighing whether I was safe enough to hear the truth. Then he exhaled. "I lost someone," he said quietly. I didn't speak. "Hospital delay," he continued. "The kind you think money can solve. Until it's too late." His voice tightened. I arrived with cash in my hand. I was ready to pay anything. "But the nurse told me the same thing they told you." His eyes met mine. "Deposit first." My breath caught. Suddenly the corridor memory slammed back into me, plastic chairs, fear, my mother's weak pulse. "So you paid mine," I whispered. He nodded once. "Because I couldn't go through it again," he said. "And because saving your mother felt like saving mine." Silence poured between us. I didn't feel romance. I didn't feel softness. I felt something deeper, respect mixed with grief. For the first time I saw him not as a powerful stranger or my corporate enemy, but as a man haunted by a moment he could never undo. And in that quiet hallway, I realized something terrifying. The more human he became to me, the harder it would be to do my job without breaking someone. It was a Saturday afternoon when my mother's voice reminded me that even though I had climbed floors and worn heels with power, I was still someone's child, still someone's only hope. I called her from my office balcony, the lecky sun lighting up the skyline behind me, just to check in. She was in good spirits at first, talking about her new neighbor's noisy generator and a rice thief in the compound. But then her tone dropped, slow and heavy. "Maka," she said, "I had a dream." I rolled my eyes playfully, but she wasn't joking. "I saw you sitting in a big chair wearing big clothes, but people were standing behind you with knives." My smile faded. "Mummy, I'm fine." But she pressed on. "Be careful. People don't like it when a woman becomes too visible, especially when she doesn't kneel for them." I laughed it off and promised to buy her bread and Titus fish. But when I ended the call and turned around, something about her words stuck to my skin like cold sweat. It wasn't the dream. It was the way she said it. The way she had said the same thing the day before I left for university. And for the first time in months I felt a strange tightening in my stomach. Like something was watching. The next week I noticed it, a black Toyota Corolla, old model, parked 2 gates from the office every evening, engine off, windows tinted. The same car outside my gym. Once near my estate. At first I thought it was coincidence, but Lagos doesn't repeat accidents. One evening I stepped out of the building and saw the car again. This time the driver's door opened just slightly, not wide enough to see a face but enough to be noticed. I didn't show fear. I entered my Bolt ride calmly, gave my driver a fake drop-off point, and asked him to circle back to the estate an hour later. Then I called Dammy. I didn't want to. But something about the car made me feel like this wasn't just corporate sabotage anymore. "I think someone is watching me," I said plainly. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "I'm sending someone to follow you home." Quietly. The way he said it made me realize he'd been expecting this. That scared me more than the car. When I got home that night I locked my door twice and lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. I had power now. I had access. I had influence. But for the first time since I stepped into Adeyemi Maritime I no longer felt safe. Dammy didn't bring it up directly the next day, but his actions spoke loudly. My access card suddenly worked faster. A quiet, suited man now stood outside my office at all times, not aggressive, not obvious, just there. I pretended not to notice, but I appreciated the silent shield. Still, I hated needing protection. I hated that after all my fights for respect, I now had to depend on the same man I was supposed to be auditing. But Lagos doesn't care about your pride. Lagos reminds you that being right doesn't mean you're safe. That week, Dammy and I had to sit through a tense vendor review together, and something shifted in the room. He didn't interrupt me once. He let me lead the questioning, let me cut through the lies, and when one vendor slipped and admitted to duplicating invoices, Dammy said nothing. He just looked at me and I saw it in his eyes. Not ego, not defiance. Respect. And that scared me too. Because the moment you begin to trust a man like Dammy Adeyemi, you stop preparing for when he might become your enemy again. We began working late nights, not because we were forced to, but because the pressure from the board had turned every day into a countdown. The company's internal fraud timeline was messy, layered with years of manipulation. Some of the old guards still tried to test my authority, but Dammy now shut them down without hesitation. "You heard her," he'd say. Just that. But it echoed like a loaded gun. Still, we barely spoke about anything personal. He never brought up the hospital. I never mentioned the car. But sometimes I'd catch him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Once, while reviewing a logistics report, he said softly, "Do you ever get tired of fighting?" I didn't look up. Only when I forget why I started. That night we walked to the elevator together in silence. When the doors opened, our reflections stared back at us. 2 people who were no longer strangers but not yet allies. Something fragile was forming between us. Not friendship. Not romance. Something like wounded partnership. And in Lagos that was more intimate than love. The pieces began to fall into place the day I finally got access to the full payment trails. It wasn't magic, just pressure. I threatened to escalate the IT team's delay to the board chair, and within 24 hours the files landed in my inbox. I stayed up that night combing through Excel sheets, scanning through rows of dates, vendors, wire transfers. That's when I found it, the same company name appearing under 3 different bank accounts, with 3 different TIN numbers, all funneling payments to the same shell beneficiary. The account was buried under layers of departmental approval, but one name appeared again and again. Richard Obasai, Dammy's chief financial officer. That explained the sudden hostility. The blocked access. The media leaks. Everything pointed back to him. He wasn't just skimming money. He was running a full-blown operation, fake vendors, diverted contracts, and when I checked his political ties I almost dropped my phone. Richard wasn't just a thief. He was protected. Sponsored. And if he was willing to leak stories about me now, it was because he had seen me coming, and he was preparing to burn the building before I exposed him. 2 days later the attack began. First came the blog posts. New director at Adeyemi Maritime linked to secret romance with CEO. Then came the doctored photos, screenshots of me entering Dammy's car, a cropped image of us at a strategy dinner, quotes twisted out of context. I woke up to headlines designed to destroy my credibility. The company group chat was buzzing with gossip. Investors started requesting clarification emails. Dammy called me into his office, jaw tight. "You need to respond," he said. I shook my head. "If I respond, I validate it. If I stay silent, I'm complicit." He paused. "Then what do you want to do?" I looked him dead in the eye. "I want to finish the audit. Then I want to bury Richard Obasai." Dammy didn't argue. He just nodded once, slow and grim. For the rest of that week I worked like a soldier on a mission. I stopped smiling in meetings. I answered gossip with silence. And when Richard passed me in the hallway with his fake grin, I grinned back because I knew his days were numbered. And nothing scares a corrupt man more than a woman he can't intimidate. The human body knows when you're about to break. It starts slowly, missed meals, forgotten texts, shoulders that don't relax even in sleep. I was holding it together with caffeine and spite. But on the day the fourth media outlet published a story about how I seduced my way into the boardroom, I snapped. Not in public. Not in a dramatic meltdown. I just walked into the executive bathroom, locked the stall, and cried until my body shook. I remembered that girl in the hospital corridor begging nurses with a cracked voice. I remembered the vow I made, never kneel again. But now it felt like Lagos was trying to drag me back to the same powerless place. When I returned to my office, the room felt colder. My assistant asked if I wanted to postpone the audit meeting. I didn't answer. I just sat down, opened my laptop, and stared at the spreadsheet, all the numbers, all the files, all the weight. And then, for the first time since I took the job, I whispered to myself, maybe I should walk away. It was Dammy who saved me, not with flowers, not with speeches, but with presence. He knocked, walked in, and didn't say anything for a while. Then he sat across from me and said, "I know that look. I've worn it before." I didn't reply. He leaned forward. "When my sister died, I disappeared for a year. I left the country, shut down my life, because I blamed myself for trusting a system that failed her." I looked at him, surprised. He had never spoken so directly. "When I came back," he continued, "I thought if I made enough money I could outrun the guilt. But the guilt doesn't care about your bank balance. And the people who killed her, slow negligence, empty chairs, corruption, they still sit in power." His eyes locked onto mine. "I didn't pay your bill because I'm a good person, Amaka. I paid it because I needed one win. Just one." My throat tightened. "And now?" I asked. His voice lowered. "Now I need a partner who doesn't break. Even if I have to hold her up sometimes." That night I didn't cry again. I didn't quit. I reread the audit files, sent my assistant a message. "Confirm audit review for 8 a.m. And then I whispered a new vow to myself. If I fall, it won't be from weakness. It'll be from fighting. It started like all corporate storms do, with a leak. An anonymous email sent to the board, to the press, to investor liaisons. The subject line read, "CEO complicit in internal corruption scheme." Attached were selective documents, doctored to cast Dammy in the worst possible light, contracts he never signed, payments he never approved, threaded into a timeline that framed him as the architect of it all. The moment it hit the media, all hell broke loose. Phones rang non-stop. Board members demanded emergency sessions. Clients threatened to pull contracts. Staff meetings turned into whispering circles. Journalists camped outside the Victoria Island HQ. The audit team I led was suddenly caught in the center of a hurricane I didn't summon. But worst of all, the board chairman called me in and said, "This is your chance to prove you weren't protecting him. You'll draft the recommendation for suspension, immediate effect." The words didn't shock me. I had seen it coming. Richard Obasai had finally made his move, and he made it with enough fire to burn Dammy out of the company completely. I stood in that office staring at the chairman and realized, this wasn't about loyalty anymore. It was about truth. And truth in Lagos is rarely convenient. Dammy didn't say a word when I delivered the news that the board was leaning toward suspension. He didn't argue. He just sat at his desk, hands folded, and listened. His face was calm, but I could see the storm in his eyes. "I told you they would come for me," he said finally. "I just didn't expect you to be the one standing at the door." I hated the way that sentence felt like betrayal. But I had done my job. I had documented the corruption trail, followed the numbers, and exposed the rot. What I hadn't done was point a finger at Dammy, because I hadn't found any proof tying him directly to the transactions Richard controlled. But the board didn't care. They wanted distance. They wanted someone to blame loudly enough that investors could breathe again. "You're not guilty," I said. "But you were complicit by silence. You knew Richard was dirty. You just didn't confront it fast enough." He nodded. "Because I didn't think it would ever reach this far. I thought cleaning house quietly would protect the company's image." I leaned forward. "Image won't save you now. Only full truth will." And when he looked at me again, something in him shifted, like the old CO finally cracked. Not from fear, but from the weight of everything he'd held in for too long. The boardroom felt colder than usual when I entered with the final audit findings. Seated at the table were men and women who had once praised me for being sharp and objective. Now they watched me like I was a liability, a young woman caught in the middle of a scandal that could either validate their decision or make them look foolish. The chairman cleared his throat. "We've read the report. You've done thorough work. But what's your recommendation?" Silence. Everyone leaned in. I placed the folder on the table, looked each person in the eye, and said, "Damalola Adeyemi is not the source of the fraud. He did not authorize the payments. He did not benefit from the shell accounts. The system failed under his leadership, yes. But the crime belongs to Richard Obasai." Murmurs. Raised eyebrows. The chair tapped his pen. "So you recommend what, disciplinary review?" A slap on the wrist. I didn't flinch. "No. I recommend two things. Richard's immediate dismissal with evidence handed to EFCC. And Dammy's retention under a probationary condition with power redistributed across a 5-person interim executive panel." The room froze. "It's not charity," I added. "It's accountability." For a second nobody spoke. Then slowly one voice said, "She's right." Then another. And another. And I exhaled like I hadn't breathed in days. I had chosen a side. Not Dammy's. Not the board's. Just the truth. When I told Dammy the board accepted my recommendation, he didn't smile. He just sat down slowly and whispered, "I thought I'd be gone by now." I nodded. So did I. He looked at me for a long time, not with pride, not with gratitude, but with something deeper. "You didn't save me," he said. "You saved the company." I leaned against the desk. "No. I saved myself. I didn't come this far to lie for anybody. Not even you." He chuckled softly. "Good. Because the moment you do, you stop being the woman I believed in." Those words stayed with me longer than I expected. That week, Richard was escorted out of the building quietly, no press, no scenes. The documents were sent to the EFCC, and our legal team prepared a full damage control campaign. Internally, a new culture began to grow. Staff started speaking up. Dead contracts were reviewed. Ghost vendors were removed. And somewhere in the mess, Dammy stopped acting like a CEO trying to control everything. He started acting like a man willing to rebuild. Not above me. Not beneath me. Beside me. And that, more than any audit, was the shift I had fought for. Lagos never forgets a fall, but sometimes, it forgives a reckoning. The day the press conference was held, I stood at the back of the room while Dammy took the microphone. His tailored suit couldn't hide the weight he carried. Our company failed to act swiftly, he said. And that responsibility rests with me. Gasps. Flashes. Silence. But today we are not just naming those who stole from us. We are rebuilding with those who fought to stop them. He nodded in my direction briefly. No drama. No spotlight. Just truth. After the speech, a reporter approached me. You uncovered all of this. Why aren't you the one giving this speech? I smiled. Because real change doesn't need a mic. It needs staying power. That night, the apology trended on Twitter. Some mocked it. Some praised it. But what mattered was what happened after. Contracts renewed. Clients returned. Even the board chair shook my hand and said, "You earned more than a title. You earned the right to rewrite how this company is seen." Later that evening, Dammy called me into his office. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when a storm has passed, but the ground is still wet. "You haven't asked for anything," he said. I shrugged. "I didn't come here to collect favors." He stepped closer. "I want to apologize properly." I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" He looked me in the eye. "For not telling you sooner. For assuming you wouldn't stay. For underestimating the woman I once helped without knowing she'd return and hold me accountable." I didn't know what to say, so I said the truth. "I never owed you anything. Not even a thank you. But I gave it to you anyway." He smiled, small, honest, tired. "And I never expected anything back. But you gave me something more than I deserved. You gave me clarity." That night we didn't talk about love. We didn't cross lines. But there was something unspoken now, a softness that had replaced resentment. We were no longer miracle in memory. We were partners. Not perfect, but earned. I stood in front of my mother's apartment in Yaba, holding a bag of groceries in one hand and a staff pass in the other. She opened the door and looked at me like she hadn't seen me in years. "Your face is thinner," she said. "Stress." I laughed. She hugged me and didn't let go. That afternoon I told her everything. About Richard. About the board. About Dammy. She sat quietly, then said, "You did what you said you'd do." I looked at her. "What's that?" She smiled. "You made sure no one would ever kneel the way you did again." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. She reached into her drawer and brought out the old hospital receipt, still folded, still worn. "Keep it," she said. "But don't carry it like a wound. Carry it like proof." That night I walked home and finally understood. Power wasn't just position. It was purpose. It was protecting the people who'd never be allowed into boardrooms. It was remembering what it felt like to beg and choosing never to let anyone else feel it again. Weeks passed. Dammy and I continued working together, not as savior and saved, not as CEO and watchdog, but as two people who had bled for the same vision. One day, after a board strategy session, we lingered outside the elevator. "Things are changing," he said. "They are," I agreed. "And so are we." He looked at me, then really looked. "We don't have to rush anything. But if there's ever space, I'd like to know the version of you that exists outside this building." I smiled. "She exists. But she doesn't kneel either." He smiled back. "Good." We didn't kiss. We didn't declare anything. But as we walked out of the building side by side, I realized something simple and freeing. I didn't need a fairy tale. I had built something better. A life I owned. A future I chose. And a man who didn't try to save me, just stood with me when it mattered. In a city that once silenced me, I had found my voice. And I would never ever kneel again.